What's up, guys? Today I'm going to be teaching you how to take your 3D printed Stormtrooper helmet from looking like this to this. Stay tuned. Okay, so as you can see, we have all of our raw printed pieces ready to go. We got our sandpapers and we have our trusty soldering iron to weld all these pieces together. If you don't know what PLA welding is, it's a process of putting your pieces together temporarily, then melting, kind of like a weld. You're gonna melt the pieces of plastic together by the seam, sort of like a stitch or a weld. So first thing you're gonna want to do for a PLA weld is tape your pieces together. Get them as aligned as possible before you permanently weld them. Now, once you've got your pieces taped together, you can go ahead and start welding. So the way that I like to PLA weld is perpendicular to the seam. In my experience, that's given me a very strong bond between the two pieces, and it's just the way I like to do it. And you're gonna wanna not miss a speck when doing this. You don't want to be able to see through that seam at all. I like to hold it up to the light to make sure that it's completely sealed. Now I'm going to go ahead and tape the top part on, and once again you're going to want to make sure that it's as lined up as possible. And once again, weld perpendicular to the seam, all the way around, not missing a single spot. Now we can go ahead and pull off our tape. And as you can see, the seams aren't too bad. Now we're going to go ahead and start sanding. This is the 120 grit sandpaper, and we're going to use this to knock down those layer lines. We want everything to be pretty uniform. And in my opinion, this is the hardest sanding layer because you really got to get in there and get all the lines down. So this is what the helmet looks like after that first layer of 120 grit sanding. And we're going to go ahead and start the 220 grit sanding. Now, the higher grit sanding layers are pretty easy. A lot easier than the 120 grit because it's really just a nice little once over. Just make sure you're smoothing everything down that you did in the 120 grit layer. So not too hard. So in between sanding layers, I like to give it a little wash with a sponge and just get the dust off so I can see where I stand in the sanding process. So far, so good. So we're gonna go ahead and keep chugging. So here we're gonna start working with that 320 grit, and as before, the exact same thing. Just smooth it over with the 320. Just like that. Looking better and better with each layer. Look at that. Beautiful. And now we're on to the 400 grit. Last layer before the 1000 grit polish. Just like before. Just go in there and sand it. Smooth it over. Not too bad so far. Now we're on to the final layer of sanding with the 1000 grit sandpaper. But first, as I said before, if I find a lot of dust accumulation on the piece, I like to give it a little scrub. Just clean it off with a sponge, just like this. Now we're going to move on to our 1000 grit wet sand. So you're just going to want to get the piece a little wet. Then you're going to want to take your 1000 grit sandpaper and just sand like before. But this is going to give it an even smoother finish for that primer. Look at it, shiny and beautiful. That's how you want it. Now we're going to move on to our first layer of primer. This is like I'm kind of fucking this shit up. There were a lot of drips, but I'll show you how to sand those down. I was kind of in a rush with this one. But that first layer of primer is like, oh man, after all that sanding, all that work you did before, that first layer is very, very satisfying. And as I said before, I'm going to show you how to sand down and smooth over those drips. So as you can see, there are a ton of drips on the bottom of the helmet. And what you want to do is take a higher grit sandpaper. Here I'm using 120. And just knock those down. Just knock those right down. Kind of like the layer lines. Then afterward, give the entire layer of primer another wet sand to smooth this down. Since the primer is softer than PLA or plastic, it's easier to go straight from a lower grit to the 1000 grit. You don't have to worry about working your way up. At least in my experience. And you're just going to repeat this process of primer, sanding, over and over until you're happy with what you got. Until you think it's smooth enough to put on your first coat of paint, which is what we're about to do right now. So here I'm using this Behr gloss white spray paint. It's pretty good. So when do I start painting? Here we go. Just go for it. Go crazy. Obviously avoid trips, but yeah. This first layer of paint was so satisfying to do. This helmet looked beautiful. After the paint dried, I was able to touch it. Oh man, it was amazing. Make sure you get the back and the undercarriage as well. A lot of you might be saying I'm a little too close, and I am. Very much so. But miraculously, I somehow avoided drips. So, yeah. So here we have the final product of that white base coat anyway. And it's not looking too bad so far. Now you might be wondering, there's something he missed. Yes, I did not fill in the seam lines after PLA welding. But as I said, I was in a rush with this one, so I didn't really get to it. But anyway, now I've taped off the parts that are meant to stay white and exposed the parts that are meant to stay black. And I'm just going over them with a nice gloss black. Here, I realized that I completely fucked up the paint job. I did not wait for the white paint to fully set, and the tape left some really bad deformations and sticky residue on the surface. So now I'm gonna try to hide that with some wear and tear. going to add black paint, black acrylic paint mixed in water to the surface, and then I'm going to wipe that down. It'll give a nice weathering effect to the helmet. So yeah, just be patient with your paint jobs, guys. Make sure your paints are fully set before you tape off anything, because the tape will mess that shit up. So yeah. Now, one thing I forgot to mention was the chin parts. Those pieces were printed separately, and I gave those the exact same treatment: sanding, primer, and paint. So here I'm adding the parts, the little gray details. Just taped off everything else. Left these details open. Just gave them a single layer of gray paint. So not too bad. And here we've got the finished product. For a botched paint job, not too bad. Not too bad at all. I could have done a little better on the weathering, but I was kind of rushing, and I was kind of panicking. I was like, oh damn, this paint job is completely fucked. But yeah, it's not terrible. I like it. I am not mad at the way this came out.